Can we start with the word culture? Cindy, we hear this a lot from regulators, hear increasing amounts from regulators. Is this really a matter of legitimate regulatory interest, do you think? Is it not a matter of internal for the firm?
I would say that the regulators, in terms of the analysis of the failings of the past, they have looked at very significantly the root causes of some of those failings. And I think the behaviours, not just culture in its widest context, but the behaviours of what have happened in some of the organisations leading to some of those failures has been a significant focus. So when you tie culture alongside governance, I think it is absolutely imperative for supervisors and regulators to look at. I think there's been enough case studies and scenarios of what they've seen to suggest that actually leadership and turn from the top and the behaviours of how that manifests itself within an organisation is actually absolutely crucial. And there's been lots of cases in the public domain to suggest that. And what we've seen from the regulators, particularly both the PRA and the FCA, but particularly from an FCA perspective, culture is firmly part of their supervisory framework and firmly within their remit of how they're assessing firms and how they are behaving, both from a governance perspective as well as how firms do things. So I think it's here to stay.
Okay. Here to stay, Letitia. Are you concerned at all that perhaps a monoculture is being imposed on the financial sector in some way through this supervisory drive?
I'm not really worried about a monoculture in and of itself. I think if everyone was customer centric, I think that would be appropriate, and that would be an appropriate culture for us to have as an industry. I think focusing on culture and the outcomes of your behaviours and how we operate as firms, I think we all make mistakes, and it's how we identify and address those mistakes. I would be slightly concerned that the further away that we get from the pain of the financial crisis and all of those rectifications that we've gone through, and so we'll see next year the end or the deadline for PPI, I am slightly nervous that complacency can creep back in. So the big focus is, how do you keep that customer voice and focus at the heart of everything that we do when we think that we've kind of got there, actually.
Okay. Now, the regulatory emphasis on culture has gone very much hand in hand with the accountability drive embodied in the senior managers regime in the UK. Wayne, the insurers are about to fall into the full regime next week, I guess. What lessons do you think they can learn from the banking industry in this area?
I think it's been very helpful not to go first. I mean, practically, it's always useful when there has been some time considered by many different organisations about the rules, and I think that we have definitely learned from that, as there's been a greater consistency and of understanding of what's required. I think in particular help, and probably on the more practical side, it's helped us to really size the population of who it is that we see is captured by this regime, and to have a better sense of how far down into the organisation you go. I think more generally, the insurers are probably in a slightly better place, having implemented SIMA. The incremental piece there for senior managers in particular, yes, it's capturing a few more folks, but a lot of the principles are the same. There are probably two big changes for insurers. It's the certification regime. That's capturing people who are at a much lower level in the organization, who might be captured by training and competency regimes. These tend to be at a much junior level, may not have had that much exposure to how regulation has changed over the last few years. And to be frank, we've had some interesting discussions around risk and remuneration in that space. Where I think that there is a much larger change is for the solo regulated firms who won't have been part of SIMA, and really haven't had much activity in this space for quite a while. I think the change in the governance for them is going to be very significant. You'd expect it to be positive, and to eventually lead to some positive changes in culture.
Okay. I've got a message that we've had an interesting question on board effectiveness from the audience. Felix, would you like to read it out to us?
That's right, Andrew. We do have a question in on board effectiveness. So it's as follows. Few would disagree that board effectiveness is essential for firms to succeed, but peering in from the outside of the organisation, how can supervisors assess what really goes on within the boardroom and whether the board is effective?
Matt.
I think it's a difficult challenge. I mean, you are going to have to test at different levels of an organisation whether or not what is being agreed and what the board are presenting to you as a supervisor as being, the firm's approach in different areas actually is translating into reality, into change on the ground. And I think it comes back to the reason why culture is so important, because unless you have sort of infinite resource as a supervisor, your ability to do that consistently globally is going to be very, very difficult. But if you can get comfort that the organisation itself is an organisation that will challenge itself, will allow criticism to flow up, allows that sort of feedback, and that the board are reacting to that, you can see it in the evidence of their own discussions, then you can perhaps remove some of that burden.
Thanks for that. Turn to a subject we have touched on already, which is the vulnerable customer subject. And Letitia, this issue often comes to a head over access issues, particularly as technology advances. It is potentially disenfranchising certain groups of consumers. I mean, what actions do you expect supervisors to take on this in the next 12 months or so?
So we see lots of activity from our regulators under the topic of vulnerability. And I think the big challenge there is just how wide the concept of vulnerability is. So it's not just vulnerability for some individuals is a constant, but more often than not, people dip in and out of it depending on what's happening in their life circumstances. Knowing or being able to confidently say, I know that my customer is vulnerable, that can be a real hard test for us, I think, within the industry. But when we do have evidence, I think it's incumbent upon us to show that we've considered what our actions and our products are doing to help alleviate any of the kind of pain points that those customers experience. And being able to demonstrate that when we consider products, when we consider services and distribution methods, I think is essential to demonstrate that as an organisation, vulnerability is very important to us.
And Wayne and Matt, do you think that there's a risk that in this area, particularly around this sort of access point, the boundary between financial services regulation and sort of wider social policy is getting a little bit blurred?
I think we're probably naive if we don't think that that's inevitable. I mean, the idea that financial services could exist somehow divorced from societal expectations more broadly, and I think Letitia mentioned up front how quickly politicians, regulators pick up on public concern. So, we need to be aware of that. I mean, we need to be thinking about how our actions, our products have implications for broader society.
The digital point, I think, is also broader than just access, because there is, I think, an increasing and somewhat worrying tendency for firms to utilize digital service channels as a mechanism to deal with vulnerable customers without really thinking about whether or not that is appropriate. I mean, I've had occasion to actually use some of the call centers and so forth, which have been put in place for vulnerable customers recently, and there's a very wide degree of the level of service provided, and actually on a number of occasions was almost pushed towards filling out an online form rather than wanting to speak to someone. which is a very worrying trend.
Cindy, from what you're seeing in the firms you're in contact with and dealing with, I mean, what do you regard as the top priority actions on the vulnerability front at the moment?
I think there's a lot of activity that's going around in firms with regards to vulnerable customers. I think there's a lot of challenges as well, because actually the ability, because vulnerable customers as a definition is such a broad group, and as Letitia's already articulated, people come in and out of vulnerable points at certain points. Clearly physical disabilities and things like that are clearly identified from service and operational centres in terms of how you potentially interact or communicate with a customer. But there's other aspects of vulnerability, such as financial vulnerability, where people come in and out of different points in time depending on what's happening in their life circumstances. There's points where people may have suffered bereavement, which would cause certain vulnerabilities, or they have emotional states which may cause other points of vulnerability. And actually for organizations to actually identify that and to identify the varying states of vulnerability which may arise, not only digital and access and all those things that may arise, but just actually where life circumstances are, actually that's really difficult. And actually, so some of the priorities are actually, what is our MI telling us? What are our people actually doing? Are our people properly trained to actually identify and therefore be sympathetic and empathetic when those circumstances arise? So I think there's quite a lot in terms of prioritization. And firstly, being able to identify when vulnerable circumstances arise for an individual, and then being able to handle that as the person who's sitting in front of that customer then and there, or at least referring them to another colleague who is able to deal with that. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be focused around the actual customer interface, not just the system controls and systems and other things that happen within an organization.
Okay. Now, sort of a universal vulnerability, of course, is the whole cyber issue. I mean, a lot of supervisory activity on this in the last few years, understandably. Letitia, I mean, are you expecting any more supervisory initiatives in this area in the next 12 months or so?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm expecting other than more, actually. I think the environment is so dynamic, so we don't know what the next attack will be, actually, and I think that makes regulators nervous. It makes my board nervous. It makes me nervous, and therefore being able to demonstrate that we're as up to date and as robust as possible, I think, is essential. But also always trying to make sure that we are as interconnected as not only as a banking or a financial service industry, but almost as a UK PLC, because this for me is not it's not a competitive issue. This is a security issue, and I think that's the way that we should view it. So I would expect far more from regulators, and I would expect more connectivity from regulators, particularly around the financial system, and how an impact on one firm could impact the rest of the system.
Thank you. So, talking about nervousness, one thing that does make some people nervous is just how much of the capital requirement for banks and insurers is now generated by admittedly approved regulatory models. Wayne, is that nervousness justified? Or?
At the risk of going out on a limb, I'm actually a bit of a fan of internal models.
I thought you might be.
Because I think the alternative is a far worse position. You know, having something which is specifically tailored for your risk profile is, I think, a far better outcome than a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, I look at the usage of internal models, certainly in the insurance industry, and there's a considerable number still in the UK and even more in Europe of firms on the standard formula. And you look at things like the allowance for operational risk in the standard formula and think, well, that's unlikely to be enough. But then there are other aspects of the regime which go the other way. And whether it all comes out with an appropriate number at the end of it almost seems a bit too much like chance, really. I mean, internal models, I think, do have their problems. They can be quite cumbersome. The requirements around changing your model can be quite onerous. So maintaining that flexibility and agility can be quite challenging. Where I think there is potentially a problem with models is the tendency when thinking about hedging to hedge the model rather than what you think might happen in reality, because if you design a hedging program around varying different outcomes, it's unlikely that that is going to be capital efficient. And if what you're really interested in is improving your solvency position, then you would hedge the model rather than what you expect to happen. And that's a balance which firms have to tackle.
Yeah. Now, I think we had another interesting question from the participants on this. Felix?
Yes, we do have a question on internal models. So the question is, do supervisors need to build their own capital models in order to assess those of firms?
Vishal?
I think it's one way of going. I know certain supervisors have done that, not across the board by any means, but in specific areas. I don't think it's a must. I think reviewing a firm's models in and of themselves, understanding how they've been parameterized, the quality of the underlying data, the governance around it, I think having the right expertise applied from the supervisory side in each of those areas would give one a robust enough understanding of the extent and level of reliability of those models and whether they're being properly used, the extent to which they are actually reflective of experience and expected experience, expectations and so on. So I don't think one has to, a supervisor has to develop their own models. The other issue you have with that, there was a comment earlier around creating a monoculture. If you start, it would be unlikely supervisors would ever be able to create specific models for the risk profiles of every institution that they are supervising. And therefore, you're just creating a centralization of quite a significant systemic risk, I think. I think that in itself makes it quite challenging. And if they were going to go down that route, they would have to be very nuanced in how they deployed that central model.
Yeah, the risk of herding and...
creating that herd mentality. And as you know, the industry would then tend to replicate or understand what the supervisor's
You'd
doing.
have a standard formula,
Yes.
basically, wouldn't you? Yeah.
And do its hedging strategy and its capital management against that. You get a big systemic risk developing there, which no one would necessarily pick up on until it was too late in terms of movements in the market.
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
I think the other thing that boards would really struggle with on that is that they would really start to question ownership. When we were all going through the internal model calibration process and having discussions around what an appropriate interest rate stress was, there was lots of debate of that nature. And then if you then had a centralized view from the regulators on what the appropriate model was as well, then I think that question of ownership becomes quite difficult.
These are big issues and our time is almost up. I want to use the last 5 minutes, if I may, to cover the other big theme we highlight under the supervisory constants, which is the business model analysis approach, which supervisors, both prudential and conduct, are increasingly taking. And what I'd like to do is perhaps ask each of you in just a few words, as you peer into the mist, into 2019 and beyond, what do you see as the key prudential or conduct risks which the supervisors will be looking to assess business models against, the resilience of business models against? What is going to be most on their minds as they look at firms' business models? Can we do that in turn, Wayne, from your perspective?
I think that if I just talk about the FCA for a moment, and we have seen the FCA's focus move from, certainly in their terminology, from customer outcomes to customer harm, coming much more into their language. And I'm not entirely clear I understand what that means. I mean, I know what customer outcome means, and I know what customer detriment looks like. And so one of the things which I'm interested to kind of see how this develops in their supervisory strategy is how that really differs from the regime that we've been living under to date.
Letitia?
For me, from the PRA's type perspective, I think It will be about where we are at this point in the credit cycle, and the sustainability of business models as we progress there. I think then making sure that our stress tests have been sufficiently robust and sufficiently frequent and dynamic, I think will be important. And then from the FCA's perspective, I would predict, it's one of the other topics that you had called out, data risk actually. I don't believe that the public in general have fully understood the importance of their personal data as a personal asset. And I think as that increases and as we appreciate that more from a business perspective, data risks will increase across the industry.
Yeah, I've seen clear evidence of that.
I'd agree with all of that. I think I'd add to it a focus on outsourcing dependencies on services being supplied from third countries, particularly for European prudential and conduct regulators if those services end up being in a third country in London. But yeah.
I agree with all that. I would also add, looking at business models, new fintech opportunities and startups and how that might impact on traditional business models. You look at some of the credit apps that are potentially out there in the marketplace, that how people are using those, as well as when you think around some of the other disruptors that are in the marketplace, whether it be third parties, fintechs, other things like that, how that will actually impact on the traditional models and actually profitability, where that will come from, particularly as organizations have actually looked at simplifying some of the products that they have and therefore, by its natural case, maybe some of the margins.
Vishal?
And Andrew, you'd be disappointed if I didn't say Brexit. So I think, so I will say Brexit. I also agree with the previous comments from the panelists. I think it's all around, if there isn't any deal, then I think that becomes a core focus of supervisory focus, a core area of supervisory focus for obvious reasons. I think the resilience of the system, the ability of the financial services firms out there to withstand that, the impact on the kind of the real economy. I don't think that's been, well, I know that there have been some studies and the Bank of England issued some numbers, but I think how all of that feeds through and how the financial services sector deals with that, plus the resulting volatility moves, etc., currency volatility as well, will be a huge area of focus. Now, if there is a deal or a transition arrangement is put in place, then that nevertheless still means, although it postpones some of that, because of the uncertainty of the deal that would be there once we actually leave, I think it will nevertheless remain an area of focus. I think there's a little bit of a better understanding in the corporate sector and in the real economy around what this might mean for that area, and I think Brexit and all the associations with it, I think will remain a key area of supervised focus. If things do go more smoothly, I then think it's more around from the prudential side, looking at capital. There's a lot of discussion at the moment around whether the next financial crisis is going to, why it's going to arise, where it's going to come from, and when.
Yep.
A lot of commentators seem to think it's fairly imminent, perhaps not the next few months, but definitely the next 12 to 18 months. So I think, although it's very hard to know where that's going to come from and how to prepare for that, I think looking at resilience, capital, liquidity, all of those aspects will be a key area of focus for not just regulators in the UK, but internationally.
Panel, thank you very much. Interesting how the sort of viewing all this through the business model lens leads you squarely back to the supervisory constants and and the unique cross-sector issue of Brexit. So I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Fascinating discussion. Firstly, warmest thanks to the panel for a really enthralling set of insights. Very, very useful indeed. It's been great to hear those insights on such a wide range of challenging subjects that we've lobbed at you. Thank you also to everyone who's participated in this webcast. I hope you found it both entertaining and enlightening. Before signing off, let me remind you that if you do want to explore any of these issues in more depth, you can go to our deloitte.co.uk/reg outlook, where the issues are set out in great depth, and indeed some other issues are covered as well as part of our regulatory outlook publication. And also there will be, along with that, you'll find the use of the interactive regulatory timeline tool as well. So finally, it remains for me to send seasonal greetings to everyone on this webcast today, and to wish you well for 2019, whatever the outlook, whatever that year has in store for us. Thank you all very much.